We are now going to try something I have not done before, a panel discussion where I have tried to assemble very different views on storytelling. All of you are experts in your own ways with different experiences and different evidence that you've worked with, and also different practices that you've encountered. So I'm very curious to learn from you, and in fact to start a dialogue that will continue hopefully after this evening. Now, I have invited seven panelists, but not all of them can be with us tonight. Unfortunately, Kevin George has been called away to a ceremony that happened last minute, and so he sends regards to this group. And I'm not sure if David Pareca will be able to join because he has a plumbing situation at his home, and if possible, he will join us later on. And then third, Ben Skolnick has Sukkot, a Jewish holiday tonight, so he cannot be with us tonight, but he has produced a recording so that he can be part of our discussion. Now, the power of storytelling. After this day, I don't think I have to say much why I think that storytelling is a powerful thing, but sometimes it's not easy to grasp because there are so many aspects to it. And I asked the question whether it is that we as humans, as societies, or perhaps as rulers manipulate storytelling, or whether storytelling manipulates us or controls us. It is probably something that works in both directions. And I hope we'll tease out some thoughts of the power of storytelling in this conversation. I've asked the panelists to think about 3 questions, and I read out these questions. Tell me what storytelling means to you personally and to the tradition that you either study or live in, or perhaps even both. Second, what good might storytelling play in 21st century North America or other parts of the world that you want to think of or live in? And so I have to put on my reading glasses. So I want to tease out that question, the second question, a little bit more. What kind of foundation narratives or other stories currently do or potentially can help different groups to maintain or strengthen their particular identity, their feeling of belonging? And B, at the same time, how much storytelling also help us develop solidarity across group boundaries in a multi-ethnic nation or cosmopolitan world? And third, how would you describe the role of women in the stories you hear, tell, or wish for, both in relation to how you experience the world surrounding yourself and how you hope this world may develop? So that's the set of questions that I've asked to all of you in advance, and you can take 3 to 6 minutes, more or less, to develop an answer as seems fit to you, and then we'll have some round of discussion following. And I would like to start with, well, Talina, would you like to go first or last? Because you have not been part of the previous discussion, would it help you to hear the others first? Or then I give you the place of honor at the end of the circle. Otherwise, I would have introduced you first, but we'll pause with this. And I want also to pause with Eva to give you another break. So I would perhaps ask my colleague, Dr. Andrew Faulkner, first, who is Professor of Classical Studies, amongst others, the senior editor of the journal Phoenix, that's the Journal for Classical Studies of the Classical Association in Canada. And most of all, why have I invited him? He is a Homerist, and he is a hymnologist. He is a narratologist by profession, so he really has studied some of the most influential and successful narratives in the Western tradition and in fact beyond. So Andrew, what's your take on my questions?
Thank you so much, Altay. I suppose I'd like to begin with the first question, which is my own personal relationship to storytelling. And I've been reflecting a lot recently on the literature, which is, in the field of psychology, the importance of storytelling for our own self-conception. And I think also as I age, I might say, I start to see the ways in which the stories that we tell about ourselves really shape how we see our past, and perhaps sometimes in ways that are not entirely accurate, one can realize in a certain way, and yet are important for our identity and the identity we present to other people. So with that in mind, I'll talk about storytelling perhaps quickly from two different perspectives. So one is from the perspective of a Homerist, and then the other is from the perspective of someone who's been working on late antique literature, particularly Christian literature, which is engaging with the earlier Hellenic tradition and using stories to redefine identity in that context. So one thing I would highlight in looking at Homeric storytelling is the significance of the Homeric epics across really all of Greek culture, even to the present day, as forming a national identity, if we speak about nation in a very broad sense, or some kind of cultural identity that's shared. And I do think that one of the things that we see very commonly in storytelling across traditions is, as we've heard today, the creation of a shared identity. And yet at the same time, we see opportunities within narratives and even oral narratives for separation. And so if we look for example, at the catalog of ships in Homer, which I think that most people today find actually quite difficult to read. I've always been fascinated by the catalog of ships. If we think about that from a Greek perspective, it's important as part of the story because it allows individuals in particular areas of Greece to identify with a larger whole, and at the same time to carve out and understand a particular identity within that whole. So I see storytelling as doing both of these things. One thing I'd also like to say with respect to storytelling in Homer is that we think of Homer, certainly the tradition that Homer derives from, as one of oral storytelling. And scholarship, I think, understands much better now than it did 100 years ago that oral stories and written stories are constantly interacting. And that's something that I think we often find difficult to come to terms with because our evidence is written, and we don't know precisely what was circulating in an oral way, and yet we do have hints of local traditions and local stories influencing these kinds of broader narratives. So to bring it down, just finally to conclude and not speak for too long, to bring it down to the later late antique period, we see again there, I think, this process of integration and also separation, where we see Hellenes who are ethnically engaged in the tradition of Hellenic literature, Hellenic mythology, Hellenic storytelling, who nevertheless have a new religious identity, using storytelling and foundation narratives in particular, often to create attachments and also separations. So while on the one hand we see figures like Eudocia, in whom I'm very interested, a dynast in her own right and very powerful, creating a separation between pagan narratives, foundation narratives. You mentioned Daphne, for example, and she does this. We also see that the act of creating that separation in the storytelling creates continuities. So I see this kind of tension in storytelling constantly in all of the periods that I've been looking at between the act of integration and identity, and then also separation.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very interesting. I would have lots of questions. I don't ask them because otherwise we would spend the hour alone. and the questions to you will be asked by others later on. Let me move on to Mary. Miss Mary Harper gained her BA in Political Sciences only this year and is now in an MA school at the Balsillie School, also for Political Sciences and or International Affairs. And I have invited Mary because she is one of the two senior editors of the journal Epic Threads, the journal that I mentioned this morning, the first issue of which has been published last night. And it is the first journal run by students on creative writing on the ancient world, very broadly understood. And it was your excellent, your outstanding writing and storytelling skills that encouraged me to invite you to take on this task. So I wonder what your perspective on the questions is that I've asked.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm definitely the least expert of the experts, but storytelling for me has always been like the avenue to get into and interested to something. Like I got interested in classics because of Percy Jackson. Maybe some other younger people will also have gotten into it through that. So I think it's an avenue of like accessibility and interest. And when I think of storytelling in 21st century America, I think of kind of the conflicting kind of political narratives that are pushed through storytelling, as we see with a lot of these foundational myths. These are about why you deserve to be there, or like who you are as a people. And the conflict with the narrative of like Christopher Columbus comes to mind, and how that was used to like legitimize Italian American tradition, and how they had like a rightful place to be here. We discovered America, and how that kind of there became a more mainstream conflict between that narrative and the realities of indigenous peoples and colonization. And I still live, like my family home in Toronto is still near Columbus Center, and it's like a center for like Italian education and culture and stuff like that. But more and more we see that coming into conflict with the notion of like understanding reconciliation as it becomes like a more mainstream understood thing. So I think a lot of what narratives in 21st century North America are, at least politically, are about who belongs and why, and how you can have a claim to belonging. And those are complicated by other people's stories of belonging, or maybe belonging here first before you even came. And so they are a means to strengthen their identity. I think it's a difficult task of developing solidarity, because of course you always have the conflicting stories, but I think politics and also just creating a multinational and multi-ethnic world involves not just passively harnessing narratives that exist, it's about creating and cultivating ones. I think that's how you fall into these like more right-wing and exclusionary narratives, is if you're not able to offer a story that is an alternative, because they're doing storytelling. They're creating a kind of alternative reality that people can exist in. And I think you have to respond to that by producing a compelling story and vision of your own. I'm sorry to be so politics focused, but that is what I actually
That's also why I invited you. Don't apologize, not at all.
But I think you see it always at the root. Like I think of Athens' founding myth, where they pick the olive tree over Poseidon's either fountain or horse, I think, depending on the legend. And it's about how they're an intelligent people. The horse is useless here because we're rocky, and the fountain is salt water. This does nothing for us. The olive tree can be the basis of our economy. So our stories tell us like who we are and what we want to be and what our polity is. So I think that's kind of the importance of them, to try and put a classical spin on it. Sorry. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mary. That was fantastic. That was a very rich response. And again, I must hold back myself, but we will definitely continue. And I move to you, Eva. And now I do you the favor of not introducing you again, because we've had that an hour ago. but I just want to say that the main reason why I invited you again for this panel is that you bring in more than anyone else also the richness of the Near Eastern traditions, partly predating everything that's classical or archaic Greece and Rome, partly running in parallel, but it's really a very additional or very different perspective that you bring in on the one hand. And the one thing that I did not say in your introduction earlier, which I add now, is that I know that your interest in mythology is not just in classical mythology, but being a professor at Macquarie University in Sydney has also inspired you to develop components into your Greek mythology course that reflects on and highlights also Aboriginal traditions in Australia. So that is yet another field that you can talk to us about. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you so much. Let me try and bring everything together. So my personal background. I grew up in Greece with all the national mythology that you can possibly have through the school system. But I was always fascinated by the fact that these Greeks that are very Greek and don't like everyone else still go out to these other exotic places and still engage with these other populations. So in my mind, Odysseus always wanted to come back, but he did take a very long time. So, I was kind of a different kid, let's say. Everybody was really happy Odysseus went home. I'm like, why did he take that long, though? He must be having a good time all over the world. So that's one thing that led me kind of question national narratives from an early age and start thinking about what are the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. As far as defining storytelling goes, I think for me, it's projecting values. And you see that even I was so grateful to you talking about politics nowadays. You see that beyond the ownership of the land, the rhetoric is always invested with the moral values we have versus the others. And Plato has done an awful lot to contribute to this discussion. And there is a way in which the values a community holds are easily narrated or passed through storytelling and even aim at tantalizing our senses. We hear truth a different way. We feel truth a different way, depending where we were raised and how we learned to pick up the values that are meaningful to us. And I think that this would be the key toward the more international community where everybody feels belonging, that you have to accept that the mediums of approaching truth are different. We all believe in certain things, the good, being positive, productive, collaborative citizens. But how we achieve that and how we get confirmation that we do that can come in very different ways. So I think once we go past that, that's a positive step, and that's where that's what indigenous traditions, Australian indigenous traditions, taught me. It's very difficult for a classicist or anyone in the Western tradition to think of parts of nature, animals or inanimate objects, as true kins. It's difficult to wrap your head around being a blood relative of this folder. But once you somehow truly believe that and have a different relation to it, then suddenly the environment becomes alive in the way that it's no longer alive in the classical tradition. So that's an eye-opener to think that, oh, I can have this very different relationship with everything around me and feel complete responsibility for the things that are next to me. So that I think would be what I would like to contribute to the discussion, that the minute you realize we all have similar values, but we get there differently, that's the way to a more productive dialogue between the various people that all need to belong, but they want to belong in ways that are meaningful to them.
Thank you very much, Eva. Also, a lot of food for thought. And I move on to our next speaker, who is not yet you, because we will now have the recording of Rabbi Ben Skolnick, whom I introduced this morning because he was also one of the panelists, and he cannot be with us right now because of the holiday of Sukkot. I invited Ben to also be part of this tradition, for, on the one hand, because he is a pulpit rabbi for over 40 years now, and he lives in the not just biblical tradition of Judaism, but also in the storytelling tradition of rabbinism. And so he has been living a storytelling tradition that made him actually the creative voice behind the Unheard Voices of the Past, a platform that I'm running together with him. It is in his genes to tell stories and to encapsulate messages, whether they are political, ethical, philosophical, into stories. That's why I have asked him, and he has produced an 11-minute recording. As he will not be able to answer questions, we can grant him a little bit of extra time. So, Ben.
Hello. I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Rabbi Ben Skolnick. I'm coming to you by video because tonight is the first night of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and as a rabbi, I'll be leading services, so that's why I can't be with you, and sorry that I can't be in person. I have a very easy task to talk about a few thousand years of storytelling in 5 or 6 minutes. So let me try to breeze through some of the slides that I've prepared for this. And so I call this a rabbi's perspective on storytelling. We'll start with the Bible. The Hebrew Bible has many stories. In other words, there are certain texts of certain religions that really have one basic story, but the Hebrew Bible, as you know, has many stories. And something I want to emphasize is that they're very often given in parallel accounts. And I think of this as reading horizontally. That is, that we'll read one story and source criticism will say, well, there's a documentary hypothesis and things, but when you're reading in story after story, there's more than one account. There's more than one version of the story. 2 accounts of creation, 2 reasons for the flood, how many clean animals are in the ark, where Abraham was born, was Ishmael rejected, or was he actually not rejected? Why Jacob left Canaan, who bought and sold Joseph, when did God tell Moses his real name, what are the 10 commandments? And so if you have 2 stories for each of these events, and it's, I could go on and on. There are 2 versions of the conquest. One is called the book of Joshua, one is called the book of Judges. So it's not it happened this way, but the story has been told this way. It means that that the story means this when told like this, and that when told like that. And what it leads to is a pluralistic mind, right? Because it's not this is what happened. It's, well, there's a story about that it happened this way, and there's a story about it happened that way. There's one of the basic Jewish stories of all time is that there are 2 people who are arguing, and they come to a rabbi, and one gives his account, and the rabbi says, you're right. And the other guy gives his very contrary account, and the rabbi says, you're right. and a person says, well, wait a minute, Rabbi, they can't both be right. He says, you're also right. That's very Jewish. That is, truth is very complex, and we're not simple-minded about it. So the pluralistic mind encourages us not only to hear our stories, but to hear the stories of other cultures. The pluralistic mind, coming from the biblical way of telling those stories, opens our minds. But there's also, stories are told qua stories. So just two very quickly. David has sinned with Bathsheba. It is an adulterous, murderous affair because he's had Bathsheba's husband Uriah the Hittite put on the front line, so he gets killed, so that he can have this beautiful woman Bathsheba. And Nathan comes to David and he tells this story about a rich man and a poor man. I don't have time to read it with you. And he sort of sucks David in. And so David gets very mad at the rich man, and then Nathan says, you are the man. So it's a parable. If you're a Christian, you know that Jesus very often talked through parables. And in this case, the parable is interpreted. It's clear. David gets it. But he, by accepting the terms of the parable, he has convicted himself. And in another story, just a couple of chapters later in 2 Samuel, Joab, David's cousin and chief mafioso and things like that, wants to bring this David's Absalom home. And so he tells this wise woman of Tekoa to tell a story about her son, and David again gets sucked into it. And then the woman is able to say, look, just like my son should be saved, you should bring your son home. So these are stories that are told as stories, right? And they become events in the history of Israel. So in the case of Nathan, it's an incredible story. He's speaking truth to power. He is the quintessential prophet of going up, and saying to the king that he's wrong and that he's guilty. Now, so that's horizontal, that in the Bible, you'll have these different stories and stories, as stories. But moving down through Jewish history, you have something called Midrash. And Midrash will take biblical stories and re-biograph them. It already happens in the Bible when David, who has lots of sins, like in the case of Bathsheba I was just mentioning, in 1 Chronicles, that story doesn't appear. So David is already getting re-biographed within the Bible itself. But Midrash is interpretation of the Bible that was done over hundreds of years, mostly in the Common Era, from, I say, the 2nd century to the 5th century, but that's sort of just general. The Midrash will make ethical or theological problems in the Bible go away. That's what I'm also calling rebiographing. And then Rashi, the greatest medieval Jewish traditional commentator, and others will take that, will make that Midrashic version seem to be the meaning of the text. So here's another case. We all know the story of baby Moses in the bulrushes, and how Pharaoh's daughter sees that there's a baby, and she sends a handmaid, an alma, to get the baby out of the bulrushes. But in the Midrash, alma can also mean like a cubit, and so that her arm extends. So it's not the handmaiden alma, it's her long arm. I don't know if you ever saw Gumby, but Gumby's like arm will stretch. And so Midrash will also increase the miraculous. The Bible has plenty of miracles. The Midrash will even increase that. So I was asked about, well, what is the role of women in the stories? Well, everything that I did in the lecture, this morning. But also, one of the points I'm not sure if I made clearly this morning is that when you have Sarah or Rebecca or Hannah, you have these women in relationships with husbands and fathers. I think that this reflects a social reality. That is, I understand it was a patriarchal society. I'm not apologizing for that. But within that, I think that you have a reflex of the way that people actually related to each other. And that's what makes those stories work, those stories true. That all those assertive women that I were talking about reflect a social reality. Now, another aspect of Jewish storytelling is Jewish humor. Now, the Jewish people have been through an awful lot in thousands of years, and somehow we've survived. And one of the ways that we've survived, I call a deep sense of humor. But it's also this humility. Don't take yourself too seriously. Two very quick stories. So rabbis will use humor all the time. I tell jokes probably every day of my life as a rabbi. And so the rabbis will start with themselves. So they'll tell these jokes. Like there's a rabbi who was trying out for a synagogue, and a woman comes up to him afterwards and says, "Rabbi, that was the worst sermon I ever heard." And the rabbi's really very upset. He was hoping to get this job. And he goes over to the president of the synagogue. He says, "You know what that woman just said to me? She said that was the worst sermon, that my audition sermon was the worst sermon she ever heard." He says, "Well, don't worry about that. She only repeats what everybody else says." And another story about rabbis is there's a very pious rabbi, and he is a wonderful person and a wonderful pastor, but he can't speak very well. He has a brother who is a ne'er-do-well, and he is a cab driver, a taxi driver, and he's a terrible taxi driver. People take their heart in their hands when they drive with him. He's so terrible. And the rabbi and his brother, his taxi driver brother, die on the same day, and they both go to heaven. And the rabbi sees that his brother is sitting next to God at the banquet, and he's like on the 7th level down. So he says to God, "Master of the universe, why is that?" And God says, "You have to understand, when you spoke, the people slept. But when your brother drove, the people prayed." So these are examples of Jewish humor, and that self-deprecation, that humility, reflects the idea that none of us are perfect, and we can all take a jibe at ourselves. Now, something that Altay asked me to mention is that we have these unheard voices of the past. The idea really started with Altay, and he had done something like "I Am Pericles," and then I took it from there. And I think he told me that we've done about 200 of these. And these are imagining lost letters from or dialogues with ancient figures to try to make them come alive as people who have important things to say to our time. And so this is just a list. Alexander the Great, or it's actually Parmenion, and I'm actually talking about that in Barcelona in February, using this creative idea. We had, I think, 35. The idea was that these scholars were talking to Homer and asking him questions about the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in each one of these cases, we try to make them about democracy or values or something. And what's the idea? We had Seneca. You see all these different things we had. And so what is the idea? The idea is like we're in a time when the humanities are on the run. Everything is STEM. How can we make these unheard, these ancient voices speak to this generation? So one of the ideas is to make them come alive as people who have important things to say to our time. And so just to conclude, we are the stories we tell, and when we hear them, we understand who we are. So thank you for listening.
Dr. Talina Atfield is Canada Research Chair in We Will Put Our Minds Together. She's assistant professor in history, but her education has largely been in anthropology, and her research is in storytelling and reconstructing oral traditions of First Nations of the area, but also of her own First Nation around the Brantford area, if I remember correctly. I'm fascinated by the fact that she is trying to reconstruct narratives from fragments, from various oral traditions that have been archived, that she encounters, and it's so similar to what we as classical scholars do, trying to reconstruct narratives, but just from traces, from tiny traces that we have that happen to have survived a couple of thousands of years. So Talina, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to tell us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the whole day. I had some teaching and other things I had to attend to. So I guess for the first question, so I both live and study in the community in which I'm working in is Oswego, or Six Nations, Aganyagihaga, Mohawk of Six Nations. And so, yes, my research there is Dande Odeni Goraganyo. It's a Mohawk word. We have very long words. Yeah, I got these questions and I thought I'd write them down. Answers are better than that way than on the spot. But so we have our Ogara Onwe, which is original stories, and we have Ogara, which are other stories. So I want to talk to you about both kinds. But the way that I see stories is they're a form of transgenerational communication. So I can ask questions of my ancestors through stories, through material items. I was a museum curator at the Canadian Museum of History for 7 years before I came here. And so I work mostly with stories found in material culture. So I can then talk to my descendants through what the material culture I'm going to leave, as well as the kind of work that I do in bringing material culture back into our community, archival material. So yeah, I largely see this as a form of transgenerational communication. So storytelling in terms of 21st century North America. So what kind of foundation narratives? Well, our Ogara Onwe, they're like woven throughout our visual worlds, and they mostly keep us in communication. So we can, again, speak across generations. Our Ogara Onwe narratives have been woven into splint baskets, wampum belts, quill work, beadwork, pottery, tattoos, and other forms of visual expression. So they help to serve as connection points for anchoring the past to the present to the future. So they teach us about the world around us, our place within it, and our responsibilities to all of our relations, much like what you had said, our kin that are more than human. So, for example, we have one of our Ogara Onwe, the formation of our confederacy. There's a man named Tadadaho. He's portrayed as an individual with physical deformities. He has snakes in his hair. On the surface, he can be seen as a monster to be defeated and an obstacle to progress. But looking more deeply within that story, we can see one of the teachings we can take away is that healing is possible when someone shows up with patience, compassion, and willingness to understand. So our confederacy comes and rallies around this person. Instead of killing him or exiling him, we bring him into a central position in our confederacy. They comb the snakes out of his hair. They help him to become whole again. So this is just kind of one of the Ogara that are within our Ogara Onwe. So they bring him back to good-mindedness, and he becomes the key war chief for our entire confederacy. It is his title carries down. We still have a Todadaho. Haudenosaunee identity is celebrated through the annual recital of our Guyana Legoa. So we do this every year. It happens in a different community, one of our 14 communities in what is now Canada and the US each year, and in one of our 6 languages, which is really cool. So it's nice to be able to go and hear it in our different languages as well. But the retelling of our Ogara Onwe, specifically of our creation, our confederacy creation, helps to reinforce our shared identity. And this is kind of some things others were talking about, our values and commitments to peace, friendship, and a good mind. So our Ogara, our non-Ogara Onwe, just more smaller stories. And these are a lot of the ones I'm finding and working with a group of scholars from my community. They're meant to be interpreted by the listener according to what they need at that time. So different people might interpret the story differently, depending on where they're at in their lives. And in that way, our Ogara have multiple interpretations, all of which are true and correct, all at the same time. And okay, so how might storytelling help us develop solidarity across nations? So as Haudenosaunee people, we have a strong history of conciliation and cooperation through the dish with one spoon and the 2-row wampum friendship agreements. These agreements are Ogara Onwe, their original stories and foundations, encoded in wampum belts, and their stories are told again when we gather our nations. So when we gather at these big things, we bring these belts out and we discuss them, and the stories of these Ogara Onwe are told as well. And so these ones tell us about our shared responsibilities to each other in this land, including all arrivants, settlers, anyone who's here, and us. So we have a lot of practices already entrenched in our traditions of how we're supposed to get along and how we're supposed to treat each other. And then we did have the last question about the role of women in stories, or Gara Onwe. So Haudenosaunee women's centrality to community structure and operation is embedded in our Gara Onwe. Our origins as Onwe, as well as the formation of our Guyana-Ligoa. So the first Onwe came from the sky world. Her name is Ajija Gayon, which means mature flower, and she danced and sang the earth into being. She was pregnant when she fell from the sky world and eventually gave birth to a daughter who gave birth to twins who created things within the world as it came to be understood. So when Ajija Gayon passed away, her head was flung into the sky to become the moon. So now the moon is grandmother to us all. She helps people keep track of time, lights the night so her descendants don't become afraid and get lost in time. And she controls the rise and fall of the waters. She keeps company with the stars. And she regulates the monthly cycles of all female life, which guarantees that new life will be born, making her the leader of all life. Ajija Gayon was pregnant with a daughter, some call that daughter Lynx, when she came to what is now this earth. The two of them named the world around them and helped the seeds to grow. So there was already animals, they named them. They created not necessarily those things, but different things with the seeds in the world. So that's the foundation of our family relationships and our kinships. And Lynx gave birth to two sons who were also creators of different parts of the world. And then lastly, Jigon Sase is one of the co-founders of our confederacy, inventor of wampum writing, in establishing our Guyana-Ligoa, as she helped set people who came to her home on the path of the good mind and played an integral role in the foundation and formation of our confederacy. So that's what I had right now.
Thank you very much. That was very fascinating, and I'm sure many questions will also be asked your way. I wonder if the technology still remains difficult.
Almost there, I think. I think I'm almost there.
But then I would just say we open the discussion, and we can let Ben's recording follow later on.
Can help. I think if you open the video in another tab and then share your screen and you just play the video from there, it should work.
That's what it was doing.
That's what it was doing.
That's what I was doing, and then I think
I'm mad. Could somebody not in the Zoom play the sound, and then it would be heard through this and heard in here? Does that make any sense?
We have been kind of abandoned, and I don't know who ABC is. So Eric or David, but
wait one sec.
That is a very smart idea. In practice, you would have to leave one of us would have to leave the room and do it from outside. Then it might actually. Hey, yeah, actually, Maddie.
I can do that.
That may be the solution. At least your computer leaves the room, and it's up to you to leave the computer attended or not.
That's fine. If maybe I can do that. If that's, are you okay with
that? So I would still say we'll start the discussion now, and you can try to figure out something, and because we do not have too much time at the end.
Yeah.
And I would now invite each of you, perhaps Andrew, as you have started, to choose one of the other colleagues. Whom would you like to ask a question first?
Well, I mean, I suppose I'll ask a question to everyone, but I thought that you raised a very important point about what storytelling is, and I think you mentioned that storytelling for you can also come through visual culture and artifacts. But I was reflecting as everyone was speaking on what we actually mean by storytelling, and I think in a very real sense, almost everything we say is storytelling, and yet we would distinguish different types. So as historians, we're telling stories, but we see those stories as connected to evidence, and we have sort of methodological reasons for creating those stories as we do. And then other types of stories we, and if I think across all kinds of religious traditions, we don't necessarily look for, factual truth in every element of the story, and yet we find truths within the stories. So that was just something that really interested me as everyone was speaking, and I wonder what other people think about how we actually define storytelling.
Who of you is the quickest? We are not bound to any firm order, so that's.
I think you are right in many ways, and in fact, when it comes to scholarly storytelling, we've only recently have discovered that we've, as a discipline, been subject to all sorts of bias. So every time we now discuss history, we also need to talk about the history of the discipline, because we've now become more aware of what a part we play in storytelling. And in continuing certain constructions or shifting them or changing them in certain ways for certain reasons that we may be aware of or not. So methodologically, this is what may save the discipline, taking a step back and reflecting upon it. But when it comes to ourselves or our real lives, we just thrive in storytelling. We are constructs in many ways. Even because you talked about visual culture, even when we put our photos together in a certain order, or we choose which ones we're going to keep for the official album and which ones can go, that's storytelling.
I mean, I was thinking about Leonie's paper, which is obviously a very extreme example of how, even within the academy, stories that are completely, contradicting the evidence can take hold and be used for particular purposes. So that's a very extreme example, but I think in less extreme ways, it's happening as well.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Mary, whom would you like to ask a question? Or make a comment, as Andrew did, to continue the conversation?
I was just wondering how you thought indigenous storytelling of terms of like I'm so sorry I forgot the term, but like your origin stories and stuff. How do those work with and like the kind of narratives of like settlers, how they try and build their like place here, and the narratives of how they root themselves here, and are those to be shared? Are those private stories? I'm just genuinely curious, like, and how are they seen as in conflict, or can they be cooperative, or they can be cooperative if settlers take certain steps? Maybe this is like a massive question, but I'm just very curious.
So do you mean our stories that have settler presence in them, or like your origin stories? Like, are they considered things that can be shared, or are they considered things that are supposed to be kept sort of private or within, like, in groups? And if so, like, how do those reckon with, like, when settler stories of, like, I think of the Columbus example of, like, this is how we claim as Italians who for a long time had lots of difficulties in America and Canada, how we claim to be like rightfully here and worthy immigrants. Like, can those stories like reconcile with each other, or is that dependent on like reconciliation action by the settlers and stuff like that? I don't know. It's a couple of different questions. I'm sorry. No, I think I got it. Okay, so the we'll go our own way, like origin stories, original stories. I think most of this is like nation specific or community specific on how you have protocols around sharing and who can hear it. Like ours, for example, is published in places. It has a lot of different versions. There's a dissertation on all the different versions and kind of comparing things like that. So ours is out there. I'm sure you may come across different communities that might have different like protocols around their stories and who can hear them and who can share them, because I know there are some that can only be told in the winter or in certain times, and we have some of those too, but not specifically our foundationals. We do have in our 2-row, we have settlers built into that one. It's more of a sort of agreement between friends and how we will work together instead of like in cooperation instead of at odds. So we have narratives about how we can share that river together without interference and without extraction. And we've actually put together models of how Indigenous communities and universities, for example, can work together in that space between, or in the Oda Garahodas, to come back to those original stories, those original agreements that we made. So there's definitely room in there for everybody in some of the stories. I don't know of any specific ones, like of our Ogara, different ones that actually like, some of them have little like warnings and little discussion pieces about like maybe don't go there, don't talk to that, or don't do those things. But again, it's all about how you interpret it too. So I think depending on who is listening, I think because it's meant to be interpreted by the listener, anyone could interpret it their own way. So if you heard Ogara about, say, a bad boy and a giant crow story, and you interpreted it to mean something specific, that would still be a correct interpretation.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Good question.
Eva, whom would you like to ask a question?
I'll make a comment on what you said, and then I'll just open the discussion. What I found really difficult with Australian Aboriginal traditions is how there are stories that are part of women's business and men's business. And it's really difficult to discuss those traditions in a lecture theatre environment because you're breaching the code. And to me, coming from a Western tradition and always talking about feminism, and at the same time trying to be respectful, there was a big clash there. Like, how am I going to handle that? It's almost seemed like a lose-lose situation rather than anything else. So that's, I don't know if you've encountered that in your tradition.
We do have those. Because I'm a member of the community, I go by my community protocol, so I would not talk about those things in a lecture hall. But I do struggle with how to, what is appropriate and what isn't.
That's so, that's very relieving. The other thing I think all of us in the panel can talk about is, I've noticed that in more recent years, discussing ethnic identity as a construct has become a bit easier, but what has become increasingly more difficult is to discuss religious identity as a construct. Because the minute you start talking about myths and storytelling in a religious context, there is a contradiction there and then. So I don't know how, for example, Andrew, how you feel about that. Do you think that there is difficulty in discussing narratives in religious contexts, say in a late antiquity context?
So do you mean with respect to the idea of veracity of storytelling, the extent to which the religious tradition is taken as a sort of a divine truth in some sense,
yes.
Interpretation?
Yes.
I mean, I would say that in my experience, that varies a great deal according to tradition, according to the religious tradition. And even within a religious tradition, I think, for example, within late antiquity, if you look at the exegetical tradition, it's very common to interpret the Old Testament or the Hebrew scripture in an allegorical fashion. There's not a problem with that.
Well, Origen would maybe disagree.
Well, but I mean, obviously there's debate about this, but it's possible to do that. But then, of course, it can be in other traditions much more difficult. And so for example, one of the projects that I'm working on with two colleagues right now is a history of late antique literature. And we're three editors, and we're working in the Greek, the Latin, but then also Near Eastern traditions. And so our third editor is Hebraist. And we have people writing on early Islam, and it's very challenging because
yes, thank you.
So I do think that it can be very, very challenging, but I think it depends a lot on the tradition.
Thank you. Now, Talina, what question would you like to ask to all of them or one of them?
I think I would like to ask Mary a question. I really loved what you talked about, and you were talking about stories and how they relate to politics and political, what it is right now. And you're from a bit of a younger generation than I am. And so I'm wondering if all of the stories and narratives that your generation is hearing that are kind of rampant on social media, they're so polarized. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how these stories are creating a whole set of narratives that are just butting heads.
I will do my best. I'm not on any social media, so I'm like not a great young person to talk to about what the young people are doing.
Maybe some others can help you out.
But I think it is like it is the power of constructing a narrative, like we've seen with the kind of recent political violence in the United States. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what actually happened. It matters how you can use it for your narrative, whatever your narrative may be. And I think just there's some validity in arguing that if you're trying to just push the right thing, it doesn't matter if like what you're using is true. So I think that is like people. I haven't checked in on it again since I was really sick last week. So I apologize if there were like updates on this. But the shooting at the ICE facility, and people were immediately like, "This is a psyop. This is a psyop. This is a Fed doing it," and they're trying to like pin it on like a left-wing radical. I haven't checked in on it in a week, so I apologize if there's been updates because I was sick. But like that is like the narrative is that they're jumping to conspiracy, and it's kind of like, how can we use this to propel it? And I think people have been pushed that way because the political climate and the news climate and the storytelling climate in general isn't a good space to say, take a breather, let's wait and see what is actually happening. It feels like a fight for your life. I think a lot of people genuinely feel like whenever they see a story, even if they're engaging in conspiracy, they're engaging with it with like a sincerity of, this is my struggle to survive. Like, if we don't prove that this is the Feds and that this wasn't actually a left-wing radical, there will be more like clamping down by like the government. So I think it is very polarized, and I think people are engaging with it sincerely because they feel that they are in danger, whatever your political beliefs are. I think people feel scared, so like they are pushed to engage in like, I think the truth is also storytelling in a way, but like they're engaged in like conspiratorial storytelling more. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. I apologize that I can't
that's great.
speak too much to like what's on like Instagram right now, because I've just been like, I can't. And I deleted it all when I was like in grade 11.
They probably the best. Thank you.
There was also a lot in what you've just said. It's fascinating to present or to think, to conceptualize this debate that's going on in social media as something so essential for for individuals in our society. That also shows how powerful the discourse, the backwards and forwards between storytelling is. So that is another facet that has not been mentioned previously. Otherwise, even though you were coming from very different angles, there was actually quite a lot that was converging, even though so for me as a classicist, it's clear we know that there are so many variant mythical traditions, and yet I would say that what you have explained, every version of the story goes. I don't think that a classicist would say that from our material, even though there is a huge variety and there is a potential for development, it would require an enormous patience to tolerate every version of a story. But that would lead me to the question that does every individual in your community have the right to actually take up the story and make it her or his own by just changing the story as, say, well, I address you now. Can you actually go to your community and say, so this is my story? And do you take the freedom to tell the story then how you see it with your message? And will that be respected? Is there such a well, egalitarian approach to storytelling? That would interest me.
Well, you could do whatever you want, but it does not mean that people will, like, there are discussions about different versions about our creation story. There are differences. I'm thinking more of like our Ogara, so like the smaller stories that are like Ogara only.
Okay.
Well, the creation story has like specific elements. There's small changes in between certain things.
Okay, that's an
And so
important
those,
distinction. Yeah,
they're not like you can go in and so the way that it goes for us is if we speak in a group in front of others, we will say, this is my story, or this is how I've been taught, and you may have been taught this a different way, so please excuse me if I tell you something different than you already know. If you know it a different way, then that's the way you should carry it. And so we preface pretty much everything we do, because we're in our confederacy. We are a confederacy, and we are like a unity, a political unit. We're also individuals, so we are all of us can do that if we want to. That doesn't mean we won't be held in check. So,
can I jump in here? Can you actually change the tradition if, for example, you happen to be an inspired person or a very respected person in your tradition? Because in the Australian Aboriginal tradition, the dream, if it's a dream that truly comes from the ancestors, can help you change the story and validate it even now. In the Australian tradition, the creation time has not ceased. It happens every time someone has a dreaming. But this dreaming, to be accepted by the community, needs to be truly inspired, or at least convince others that it is truly inspired. Is there this flexibility within the community?
We have had this happen. It happened in, I think, the late 1800s when we had why am I not blanking on that right now? But we did have our tradition sort of adapt in that way, but it was added to what was there.
Yes. It doesn't replace.
Yeah, so they don't change how it went back, but in going forward, the path can change a little bit. I think this is just Haudenosaunee that I'm speaking from. So I have heard, like, we do have traditions around dreaming, but they're for different medicines. And so I do think there probably are other communities or other nations that have something similar to that, though, where they have different like pathways for addressing their stories in the past to the present, future kind of thing.
Yes.
Two things, just thinking cross-culturally. What you're saying makes me think in other traditions that the idea of divine inspiration, creating authority, is present. So, I mean, we can see this, for example, within the tradition of Christian literature, late antique literature, that where authority is called into question, then divine authority and inspiration. So, for example, in the translation of the Septuagint, we see a very, if you go to Philo, there's very sort of strong emphasis on divine inspiration and that. But then the other thing I just wanted to say, methodologically, in terms of how we understand stories, I've been thinking a lot about intertextuality and theory, about intertextuality broadly understood, and even sort of moving outside texts. And it seems to me that there is a tension between authorial intention and reception, sort of, reader or listener reception. But there is a place within the classical tradition, within literature, for in a kind of extreme methodological way, saying that reader reception is what creates meaning in that sense, and so that regardless of authorial intention, it's possible for people to understand relationships between stories and texts, which have no relationship to the original telling in some way. So there are differences there, but I think there are also perhaps similarities across those traditions.
Although we are close to the end of our time and we had to cut short Rabbi Ben's presentation, which will be included in the published recordings, I still want to give you the chance to ask at least one question, if you have one that you think, well, if you have one. So please, now is the chance.
Shakun had a question.
It was more in addition to some philosophers, but not another question. Yeah.
So obviously the conversation will continue at the dinner table and hopefully beyond. I hope everyone will join. Everyone will be invited by the Waterloo Institute for Hellenistic Studies. So so we will enjoy good company, and the conversation will continue. But still at this table, you've been so patient through this day. This is, I think, a very unique opportunity that you may ask experts from so many different traditions to ask about the wonderful topic of storytelling. So if you cannot think of a question right now, then I'd say we'll end the official part of our workshop right here. And I really would like to thank all of you, every single one of you who have contributed through your papers, through your discussion contributions, and also through your support for catering and organization. Thank you all very much again, and let's then move over to the Hüter Hotel. I think we can.
Should we thank, of course, Altay for organizing all of that, and Dorothea properly for supporting the event in such an efficient manner?
Yes.
Richard was not here, so she should be.
And Richard, yes, of course, yes.
Lest I forget, I gave credit to all of you at the very beginning, including Shannon, who also supported us very much, and Maddie, of course, here silently at the computer.